All right, happy Monday, and hard to believe we are in the final day of Q3. Nick, can you believe it? As an both you and Bob as MSPs, we are heading into Q4. This year has absolutely flown. I was reading something Gary Pica published. It's like it's selling season, and it is time. I know from a revenue side. Bob, do you feel kind of some of the pressure to bring in the bacon this time of the year? How are things going for you guys?
You know how it is, and Nick can tell you, your fourth quarter is really made by how well you do in the second quarter. You know what I mean? Because that's just kind of how it works, the lead times and everything. So if you do the right amount of work then you'll get here. More importantly, though, is during this holiday quarter, is you got to push really hard, because this is going to dictate what your third quarter next year is going to look like by how much you hustle right now between now and the end of the year. So that's kind of how that cycle worked for us.
Yeah. How about for you guys, Nick?
Yeah, same thing. Big push for strategic technology assessments, STAs, what we call them internally, but just a bunch of VCIO concepts of trying to get ahead of that conversation, because nobody wants to hear it in December. So it's like, this is our month to really tackle that and get set up nicely for the next year to execute.
Awesome. Hey, by the way, can you all of you hear us out there? Nick, I try and stay away from the STDs, but the STAs sounded okay to me. All right, welcome. And just make see if everybody can hear us okay.
Yeah, I don't see any messages.
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering really quick here. I know we're live. I just want to make sure. Hello.
Gary's not here. That's what it is.
I know, because normally there are a lot of messages saying hello.
Me. It's no, we got to fill in now. It's not going to be worth it.
Yeah. Okay. We can. Yeah. Okay. Great, Eddie. Thank you for letting us know. And we'll give it a few minutes here as people start to trickle in. So, I'm going to set the stage, and then we can, do some intros. Hey, Dagley, great to see you. So last week, Nick, and starting off, we talked a little bit about the what happened with the UK, shutting down LinkedIn's use of LLMs, and we had Brian Blakely on, who's top notch when it comes to data and privacy. I don't know why I'm getting some feedback, but I am.
I'm hearing an echo.
Yeah, I don't know where it's coming from, but let's try and. I think it went away. All right. So it transitioned, and Brian really kind of, I think, nailed it when he started to talk about, looking at data from the standpoint of how MSPs should be looking at their customers' contracts. And he basically, in kind of paraphrasing him, Bob, he was saying, there's a treasure trove of, work and revenue packed in those. Your customers have signed up knowingly or unknowingly for a lot of things around data privacy, data retention, data, getting rid of data disposal is the right term, Phyllis, and CIS terms, right? And so that it was really, he really unpacked it really well. I don't know if you got to catch any of that, Bob. You're on mute, Bob, I think.
Yeah, but I'm a huge fan of Brian. In fact, he and I are going to be talking about that whole data processing officer sort of as something we're going to add here. So I wanted to talk to him about it and go through that. But yeah, Brian's always, man, he's a wealth of information, and it's, and I tell our people here, yes, we're good at the physical layer, but this is up the application layer. You really need to think these things through. And so you need people like Brian to kind of illustrate, the box around what that target really is and what the goals are. So yeah, he's great.
Yeah. And he did such a good job of Phyllis, you weren't here, but what I love about Brian is, he sits there and, virtually role plays, right? The conversation. And you're sitting there listening to him, because this is the conversations he has with his customers, you never hear him start to talk about the tech, right? It's business. And tying risk to what business leaders, owners, the people that have the ability to spend money care about. And so that kind of transitions us to today. I was speaking with Kelvin Tegelar, one of our favorites, who's on the show a lot, and I said, Kelvin, who are the people that are really influencing the channel these days? And he's Nick's name came up, and I said, I'd love to talk to Nick. Nick and I started talking, and you'll learn more momentarily as he introduces himself. But when we found out, the work Nick's doing with the controls and looking at M365 and how he looks at data and educates MSPs, I was like, man, Nick, could we really talk about a control that's really challenging for MSPs to implement? And I'll turn off my beeps in a second. Sorry, guys. A control that's really tough to implement, and that is number 3, Phyllis. I mean, the inventories are hard as they in and of themselves. When it comes to data, which I don't have to tell everybody here on the show, right, Bob? It's used to be, hey, we worry about data on-prem. Well, that's not even close to the case anymore. So with that, Nick, awesome to have you with us. Can you tell us a little about yourself, what you're doing? You got a lot of things going on. I don't know how you sleep, because between your day job, your channels, and the product you're developing, man, you're involved with a lot of stuff.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I appreciate you guys having me on. Got a lot of inspiration just watching Kelvin in the early stages. He's actually inspiration for me starting T-, which is the blog and YouTube channel that many of you may out there follow or have heard of. If you've ever defederated a GoDaddy tenant, you might have seen my blog post on that. It's probably the most popular article that I have had out there. But I got started in the channel here at Pax8, worked there for almost 6 years, helped build our PSA integrations at that time, worked a lot in product, and then moved out and have been in an MSP here, a couple different MSPs actually, but the most recent is the VP of product at an MSP called SourcePass out on Long Island. And there I've been managing our third-party product line card, also helping out with the product that we deliver, which is a customer portal to our downstream customer base, and have actively been trying to help institute, some more of the CIS controls into our operations and everything like that. But also Microsoft MVP, have the YouTube channel where I talk about Microsoft and the MSP space every week. And part of that kind of led into mapping back to CIS and really the Microsoft standard. But this is really kind of the genesis of what I'm transitioning into next, which is a company I've started called Cloud Capsule, which helps automate the CIS controls back to Microsoft security. And so certainly excited for that, just getting off the ground. But that's a little bit about me, and excited to talk about this one today in particular, because I do think it's one of the hardest to achieve for the MSP space, especially, or SMB as a whole.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Nick. By the way, I just put your channel in chat. You do a great job with your YouTubes, man. Really, really well done. Really articulated well. And yes, Nick and I not only coordinated our backgrounds, our underwear, shirts, and other things that we're not going to go into today.
I wasn't going to mention it, but now that you brought it up.
All right. So, Bob, you're taking over for Gary today. Gary, congrats. By the way, he had a first grandchild, baby girl. If those of you that know Gary Jr., it's his daughter. So Gary is off for the day. And lastly, for those, I just wanted to share that, I'm in Tampa. For those that may be in the South, North Carolina, Georgia areas, we know what kind of devastation we just went through. So hearts out to all of you if you're dealing with the aftermath of Helene. So, Bob, you take it away.
Fire away. All right, Nick. So, one thing about it, you and I both know that there's probably a lot of MSPs on the channel that don't really actually have ever thought about this concept or heard a lot about it. So let's for a minute, let's just take it back to the basics. And why don't you talk about the CIS control number 3, data protection, and what's critical? What's critical for us MSPs to really know to implement this for our client base? What does that look like?
Yeah. So really, when you get down to the crux of it, we're talking about the processes and the technical controls you're implementing for really holistically the data lifecycle as it relates to the genesis of that data, where we're storing it, the data classification aspects, secure handling of it, and then also retention and as alluded to earlier, the disposal of that information as well. And I think it's a concept, that's been under adopted by a lot of us in this space, just because there is a lot of complexity to it, because there's a lot of human aspects involved with it, as well as some constraints around. We all get the callbacks from our customers saying, "I want to keep my data forever," right? And I also, don't have data taxonomy labels. And in SMB, we don't have what enterprise has, which is, standard roles that are fully responsible for this, like a data governance officer, and a chief data officer, even at these businesses. So over time, we've had a lot of sprawl with legacy file shares that maybe still exist today, or file shares that were migrated into SharePoint as is without articulating like this is a whole different architecture behind this. And for our customers, it actually is bringing up a lot of risk exposure for them as well, too, when we talk about just the general lack of protections they have, or if we look at some more of the sub safeguards, even things like basic access controls into this data as it exists today. So what I often find is we can go into an organization, we've been doing this more because AI has really pointed a targeted spotlight on how big of a problem that this is today. And people wanting to buy Copilot, we're having a much harder conversation with them, because we have had the use case of somebody using Copilot and somebody who shouldn't have access, getting access to payroll information by just querying into Copilot, as an example. So the concern is there. We try to educate in this way, but I think it's really good a point. It's good and bad in that, it's causing us to kind of scramble up some offerings behind this, get ourselves educated in how we can uplift, but also it's pointing a spotlight at something that does cause a lot of risk. And when we take a look at that, the organizational layer, it's not just, we talk about financial risk, it extends both into that trust layer, as well as, just the actual IP or underlying data that could be exposed either internally or externally. So a lot to unpack there, but that's kind of the high level.
Yeah, Nick, quick, Phyllis, I mean, just, I want MSPs to not always feel like, hey, you guys doing a crappy job at Control 3, so that's why I want to turn to you, Phyllis. You talk to companies, like, I think there's arguably, I think there's like people that have used the CIS controls online. Gosh, I'm drawing a blank of the controls, not the navigator, but the
CSAT hosted.
Thank you. CSAT hosted, like 30,000.
Yeah, 30,000 different organizations. Yep.
Like, it's not just MSPs, Phyllis.
No, I mean, listen, I have worked with Fortune 100 organizations, big banks, transportation, every vertical. It's very difficult, this control, because number one, like you said, not everyone has a chief data officer, but not everyone understands their responsibility in data protection, right? Additionally, a lot of these big companies, they acquire a lot of small companies, and they have no idea what's going on there. And it's a lot of also cultural differences. So, when I first started here and I talked to these big, I thought the CISO was like, okay, this is what we're going to do. And it's a negotiation across the board everywhere, right? Because of acquisition, because even if you're in the same company and you weren't acquired, there are cultural differences between here in South America, here in China, here in all these other countries. It's a negotiation. So like, while MSPs also have to negotiate with their clients, even these large enterprises have to negotiate within their same organization. And they struggle a lot with data protection. It's not just MSPs, it's everyone across the board. I worked for a big government agency, as you know. We also had to, honestly, like it was like what is it? Request for the freedom of information. A FOIA request would come through.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And you'd have to go through. And for some reason, everyone thought I had good records management. It'd be like, oh, a FOIA request came through for this. And you've got to search through your records. You've got to, there's a legal obligation there. So it's just across the board.
So Bob, before I turn back to you, I just want to
Sure.
say this. That's why I wanted to start off, and I'm going to put the 3-minute snippet momentarily in chat for you. Please listen to it afterwards. But Brian Blakely's, in essence, role play last week of when it comes to data, and I'd love your take on this, Bob, before you ask the next question.
Yeah.
Is I think MSPs, by having conversations with prospects or customers about the contracts they have with their customers, because that's where the money is. Like, if, again, like Brian says in the role play, you're like, funny, your customers care about money like you do, and he's like, so talk to them about what they care about. And if you get into that conversation about what they've contractually agreed to when it comes to data, I think it's a lot easier to get into this conversation than it is, hey, let's talk about Control 3 and let's talk about, where your data is and the importance of it. And, as he talks about the boogeyman, like if you're encrypted and blah, 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 and ransomware, I think it's a lot easier to come at it that way. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, no, that was 100%. That was the diamond that I took away from that, because everything was, everything that Brian put forward was clearly well thought out and logical, but he handed us a practical tactic that I had not considered. And that was, hey, before we get in deep into what we're doing, can I see a couple sample contracts that are anonymized, but some that you have with your customer? We'll go under NDA, whatever you need to, so we can take a look at it. That'll tell us what kind of requirements you need to be operating under when we really get started. I thought that was a really brilliant piece of information. I made a note of it and highlighted it and stapled it and everything I could, because I want to start incorporating that into our sales process. So you're right. That was by far, to me, that was the biggest takeaway I had from his discussion was, hey, look and see what your customers are, what they're contractually obligated to, because I know already that most of them have no idea what's in that contract other than the attorney they talked to get it pulled together to begin with. Or if someone was, like in our case, if someone's involved in it, they may not still be there. So all of the ins and outs aren't well known. And to Phyllis's point, before I go with Nick here, what's your next question, Nick? To Phyllis's point, if I ever run into a company that actually has an asset inventory and a routing map and a change management process, then I'll start working on their data. Then I can go work on their data stuff. But I got it right. I mean, those foundational 3 legs of the stool need to be there, but that's the price of entry for being able to step up and talk about that. Everything's built on sand if you don't have those pieces right. And I can tell you, out of 100 people that I've talked to, maybe none of them had it all. One of them may have a device inventory because they were using a system. But this goes right to Nick, to the next question for you is, what are the components that really kind of make up the whole data protection, process as it relates to both on-prem and cloud and those things? What are those? Break that down and talk about the elements that are involved in that, if you could do that.
Yeah. And really there's, 12 safeguards that are part of data protection today. And fundamentally though, if we bucketize those into some high level concepts, it's really getting into that govern layer of having a data governance strategy and kind of some basic policy definitions that you can use as your North Star to really structure, the next things that you go take a look at. But this is why I love CIS as well, because it gives us this natural kind of progression that we could look to achieve and perform a gap analysis against our customers as well. And for us, when we take a look at that govern function, we are trying, just like our baselines that we apply into our tenants, we are trying to find some agnostic similarities that we go into any customer. It's a repeatable process that we can help define. So we understand more about the operational overhead that would come to that, and we can perform that gap analysis for them. But then as we keep going there, it gets into more of the considerations for secure data handling. And that includes your basics like your access control list. It includes things like your information protection data taxonomy that you would want to start applying to basically have a a standard for what is considered sensitive or highly confidential within the organization. And that allows you to kind of build a mental heat map around the risk that might be involved with the data as well too, as it relates to the data flows. And part of that progression is also figuring out, your approved data repositories that exist within the organization. And this is where they have, you'll find that organizational difference in the sense that somebody may be all cloud, they may have on-prem file shares, they may have a third-party SQL server that's involved, in the business that they perform. And really that's where you get into some of this basic mapping and understanding where that sensitive data flow diagram could start to begin to form. And then you get into, some of the high level controls you can put in place, like your data taxonomy, your encryption of the documents, taking a look also at our retention policies. And even that is a massive conversation usually for a lot of people in SMB, because they want to store things, like I mentioned, forever. And they wanted to just buy extra storage over and over again to keep their, keep their files, keep their emails forever, and really have to come in and educate about how that's expanding their attack surface as well. So from even the cloud perspective, I like to double click on some of the basics that usually anchor into, not to spark fear in the client, but just to show them kind of how they're at risk today, that we can start to put in some basic policy protections to get them on the right path. And usually, because I'm a Microsoft guy, I just will allude to a lot of Microsoft examples in this talk.
Feel free to, because most MSPs are
Yeah.
Microsoft centric, so that's absolutely fine.
No worries. Yeah, that's great. But out of the box with Microsoft, your default sharing policy is to create an anyone link, which means if anybody clicked on it, they can access it publicly. So it's just some of the basic things like that. If it can showcase like, hey, did you know your users could do this with your finance site in SharePoint, where you have all this IP or you have these financial documents? It's usually pretty glaring. But for me personally, when I go into it with the client, I also take a look at, what customer data did they actually absorb, that downstream customer data that they capture. As an example, we're a loan company recently, and they captured, loan applications, right, which include a lot of sensitive data. Mm-hmm. And, with that, I used some native tooling, but I also was able to kind of scan through the repositories and really highlight some eye-opening statistics or just information around, did you know that there's bank account information in this site? Did you know that this person has this document on their OneDrive? And I did that with some more of the native tools in Microsoft, but you could do it, just by manually scanning, just help speed up the process for us. But that's really what anchored in a emotional response for the actual conversation to spark some interest and start to begin to formulate the ROI, against, these additional things that we need to start doing today. That will be a continuous improvement process because it's a lot to unpack. But for us, it's a significant part of the holistic MSP offer that we've typically neglected. If we think about putting in identity protections, putting in email protections, putting in device and endpoint protection, that's a standard that we do today. We don't typically take a look at this documentation layer or, data layer and say that we're, going to give you the best guidelines and we have a, 5-year plan for you as it relates to that as well too. So there's a lot, that's going to, I think, again, pour a lot of gas on it given the AI conversation that's happening too.
Yep, I could see that. So by the way, and I agree with you about, this is where the strategic conversation should be taking place as it relates to these kinds of controls. But you start out, right? The way I always see it is starting out. This is in my opinion, it is a component of the business impact assessment that you need to do with the companies regardless, right? So, but from your perspective, why don't you talk about the relationship of a business impact assessment versus, doing a real data processing, DPO sort of a process and how that relates to a business impact assessment. It's always been, we're looking at the servers and the critical infrastructure, but that's assuming they know what's actually really important to them, right? But you don't really know unless you do something like a BIA and then fit that into the overall conversation, from a control standpoint. So why don't you talk about that relationship a little bit?
Yeah, and I certainly think there's more complexity there, given it's tangibly hard to quantify in some cases, because it's like, well, you could have this exposure here, but I usually like to get into specifics so they can feel like there's some tangible anchors again that they can lean into. and for their data. And a lot of it, we talk about, what if your email was down? What if you had a business user compromised? What if you had, your network is down and users can't access corporate documents? What's our RPO and RTO targets as it relates to that? And then, with this conversation, you're really shifting that mindset into, well, again, I like to highlight the customer data that they have because it's usually the most impactful to them as well too. And it's saying, if this kind of customer data was leaked, what kind of impact would that have to your business? And that could be, again, very much intrinsic in the sense of trust, credibility, those types of things that would elicit, either churn, or it would elicit non-net new subscriptions, or, business, because of the lack of, or the PR that comes about from that. But then from the financial sense, it could also be, really sensitive information. And this lens itself warrants a higher consideration because, unlike others where we're thinking about just external threat, we also have to think about the insider threat, especially with this too. And with that, again, this is where AI is both powerful, and it creates a lot of new security concerns for us. Because one of the biggest security concerns that I hear with Copilot now, as an example with Microsoft, is that insider threat, being able to discover information, whether it's a malicious activity or they're inadvertently doing that because, even maybe let's go outside into other large language models, they're copying IP into something like ChatGPT, and they're exposing, sensitive corporate data into these publicly trained large language models, as an example. So those are concepts that I like to bring to their attention, and we lean into that in the business impact analysis, because in often cases it could be a much higher impact than if you just had your email down for a few hours, right? And then you had to have to talk about uptime or your network. If you lost a sensitive document that had a bunch of client data leaked, that's a much bigger impact to the business. So it's just perceptionally getting them to understand the importance of that.
Yeah,
I mean, yeah, they got to learn to feel it, right? I mean, that's what it always comes down to me. They got to actually feel the risk. If it's just academic, then it's much harder to get them to do what they need to do. Go ahead, Andrew.
no, Bob, I was just going to say that I just keep leaning into this, what Nick just said, that I think we've got to fundamentally shift away from FUD. That, yes, we know RANs, because I think due to all of the incidents we've had, the publicity, right? People become numb to something. So we're just instilling more. If this were to happen, what would you do? When the bad man comes, the bad guy, shifting it more to their, critical business systems, what makes them money, how that would impact them, what contractual obligations they have, what SLAs, what would that do to that relationship, et cetera, et cetera. I think, Phyllis, I see you shaking your head. What are your
I mean,
thoughts?
I totally agree. When I worked at the National Security Agency, we had the DoD and the IC as our main customer. And I will say fear never bothered anybody. And we used to say mission always wins over security, right? And it's the same thing. The business always wins over security, right? So organizations are businesses and they want to stay in business, right? And so that's why you really have to say, how does cyber actually affect the business versus, oh my God, ransomware is going to come. Oh my gosh, AI is going to come. All these, like, fear doesn't necessarily work, right? It never, you can't scare people into implementing or purchasing cybersecurity. And so that's why the BIA is so important.
The well said, Phyllis. I mean, any last thing I'll say, please continue, Bob, is like just that, like, let's get out of our cyber world for a minute, right? I've been in enough corporate environments, and I know you all have as well, when you'll often get, like, there'll be a department that's like, gosh, sales got this and sales got this and sales got this, like these resources, these systems, these investments. Well, we don't have to look at cyber to figure out where the company values putting money. Like, so that's all I'm suggesting, is that let's figure out and align to, like you said, their mission, right? The mission ultimately, not the only mission, right? But without revenue, right? Nick, I see you shaking your head, right? With the mission is obviously, we have to drive with the right intent, right? Maximizing revenue and shareholder value and et cetera, et cetera. That's where money gets spent. Nick, I saw you shaking your head.
Yeah, I mean, and fundamentally that comes back to the value translation back to down to us as MSPs, right? I think that if we're, diving in here at a deeper layer as far as this business advisor concept, but also taking a look at a broader stroke at their business and what drives profitability, it should extend into much more value-driven offers that we can provide too as their technology advisor, but also taking a look at what else could we begin to think about putting into place? What efficiencies can we drive based off of this knowledge transfer of this is how, our engine works as far as making money. And this is what we want to do. This is the risk that we have as an organization because of the industry that we're in, or, the actions that we perform as well too. So I think what I found is in doing a lot of these engagements with customers now, we're trying to take it like the approach of a SpaceX launch, right? In the sense of, we do a lot of repetitions really quickly to have a lot of learning, and whether or not they're all successful, it's dependent, because a lot of this is learning for us as well at the same time, especially in this space. But there's never been a call that hasn't been valuable, right? From an intrinsic sense, because we've learned a lot about the business itself, even if we didn't necessarily solve the data issue today, right? We still have a lot of value that comes from those calls. So it's a win-win. And that's a great place to be when you're investing time in this, at the same portion of trying to uplift them into a better security posture, but also better future-proof their business.
Nick, I would say, again, for all of us, I'm more bullish than ever for all of us out there, is for us to raise our standards. And that, think about this, like you take the Accentures of the world, right? Or any of those larger consulting organizations, right? Where are they born from? They were born from having a relationship at the accounting level, right? Large accounting firms, audit firms with those customers. They understood their business. And they're also driving the most money right now on the cyber and, all of the tangential, at the larger organizations, right? The tangential services that go along with that. So I think we need to, elevate of how we look at ourselves as MSPs. We're not the tech people, right? We're business people that happen to deliver business results through great technology and security, right? So anyway, that's off my soapbox today, Bob.
That's okay. Look, I mean, I'm with you. It's always, and I will say this, by the way, to implement these kinds of controls, especially here in MSP, one of the practical things you need to be aware of is that you have to use the systems that we have in place as MSPs to be able to support this. So you need to encode this behavior in the process so that your people don't have the opportunity to really make a mistake, right? Because you've got them funneled into our support systems in such a way that their interaction with data and notation taking and all the things that are associated with working with customers is a system process that requires them to just answer the questions, right? If you'll do that, you'll be able to stay safe. But this discussion is about, okay, well, what do we need to put in place to stay safe? So that's the last question I really have for Nick before Phyllis takes over is, what's in the broader when you're looking at MSPs, what's the biggest challenges they're going to have as it relates to data protection strategies? And, how does that change things like, business continuity as it relates to business continuity, those types of things?
Yeah, I think it's very daunting, and there's kind of three buckets that I put that in. The first is that when you evaluate most customer environments, it's very overwhelming to think about, how can I go in and begin to fix this? And that's where the data governance strategy begins to take foothold there, because whenever, I've gone in and done an assessment, even if I've used, first party or third party tools or done it manually, you end up finding thousands of documents. Like if we go and look for sensitive data as an example, we use some algorithms with regex patterns to find credit card information or bank account data. It's in thousands of documents. And then you have to filter through all the false positives on that. And then you got to find the exact root cause. And these documents could be spanning hundreds of SharePoint repositories. They could be in people's OneDrives. And so thinking about how do I retroactively go fix all this is like, it's impossible. You know, I don't like to say that word often, but it is not feasible to go in and do that. So I think it's having that strategy and moving into a place of, hey, we need to have a governance strategy and we need to put a foot in the or stake in the ground today. So moving forward, we're progressively having a continuous improvement plan on getting these things into place. The other major constraint, if I talk about a second bucket, is the end user impact. You know, we deal with this, and a lot of the baselines that we push out, MFA is a great example, right? When we went through this wave of MFA, we're still dealing with it today. But a lot of pushback on that just because of the end user disruption. If we tighten down our policies too much on sharing restrictions, documentation access, people can't work.
Right.
And so we just get a bunch of help desk tickets and we make the client angry. And that's, you know, progressively making this a harder thing to adopt for everybody, because it's causing us pain, it's causing them pain. And there's just a mutual, you know, race to say, this isn't worth our time to go in and do. We leave it as is. The third one, you know, that that Dagley actually put into the chat, most suave man in the industry, as they say.
Yeah, that's right.
Education and guidance, right? It's really educating the client around really, you know, what's the importance of putting a basic data taxonomy, you know, in place for organization to start to organize this. How can we get away from legacy, really nested permission sets into a modern hierarchy of access controls within the ecosystem? And how do we know, you know, that our sensitive documents are protected? Nobody I asked that question to as a customer, anybody, is able to tell me any confidence in all of our data is safe, and we know that our users
Uh-oh.
aren't blasting have customer data, you know, that's protected, that we know it exists. Even with some of the, you know, the information that we can surface, being able to show some really enlightening data to the customer where they can see that, you know, tax information is really exposed and it's in people's OneDrives in sense as well too. So lot of various challenges here that are harder to overcome, but it's really about that micro progression and having that data governance strategy to holistically point to your North Star about what you go in and do next. And then, you know, educating the client, much like cybersecurity is today, about that. So yeah, a lot to consider there.
All right, Phyllis, over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, I really appreciate that part of the data governance too, because you know, it's hard to figure out that big picture and say who's responsible for what data and where it is and all of that. So anyway, Nick, I know that you recently worked on some projects where you had to focus on data disposal, which is something oftentimes we lose sight of because we're so busy trying to figure out where all the data is, how important it is, and how we're going to protect that data. But you even said up front, you know, do you really need to pay for keeping onto all the data all the time? So how do you go about talking to clients and getting them to understand the importance of, you know, data disposal? And was there a specific business driver or regulatory driver around this?
Yeah, I certainly think that the regulatory driver makes it an easier conversation. Still not easy in general, but it brings light to some of the things that they just need to conform to. Like, you know, a healthcare company I just worked with last month had a basic retention policy in place because they're following HIPAA standards, you know, and for them, that is something that they just need to follow, and they just adhere to it because they're going to get audited against that. So we begin to have, what I did with them though is brought it down to a more micro layer of even looking at further granularity of those retention policies against different repositories that they had because of the classification of data that they were working with. And really it gets back down to that conversation of talking to them about, you know, this attack surface, the risk to their business, right? And the continuity to their business being ever, you know, expanding. If you want to see an email from 2002 and you have fear about losing that email over the risk of, you know, all this other sensitive data that could basically collapse your business if it got exposed, would you take that risk? Would you take that bet? Most people would say no in those use cases, but they continually will ping us and say, give me an Exchange Online Plan 2 license, bump up my quantities, turn on archiving, you know, like, let me retain this data as long as I possibly can. So it's a harder conversation to go into there, I think, in leaning into that attack surface motion. And then for the people who are financially motivated, which most of the SMB is in this way, we try to pair that with the data storage cost. A lot of people are tacking on this additional cost every single month to hold terabytes worth of documentation in SharePoint as an example. And we can usually point to the risks of the business plus cost savings as a way to institute basic retention policies that they could begin to adopt. And having something is better than nothing. If they say it's 10 years, that's much better than indefinite. If they say it's 7 years, it's better than indefinite. So we're going to try to chip away at that conversation as much as we can.
We also talk about just, I don't know if you can touch upon this, like securely disposing of data. It's not just like deleting it and then it's gone. You just want to make sure also that, you don't want someone's credit card data, if you're going to get rid of it, to get exposed, because they still may have that credit card and all that kind of, data that lasts a long time.
Yeah. And with that, there's a lot of native secure disposal concepts within Microsoft, which is great, just for lightweight deletion and basically making sure we're ripping it out of these various repositories that exist, or even the linked sharing, that's going on across internal and external participants over time. But generally speaking, you really need to start to develop an SOP around that secure data disposal, especially as it relates to other third-party data repositories that might exist as well that you're consuming out of, like your file share or your SQL server or whatever that might look like for the customers. So in that way, we take a look at just, hard deleting, or, even if we have cold storage for backups as an example to that, that's another way in which we have additional protections. And that cold storage concept also helps alleviate that conversation of retention if we need it. If we need to play that card in the sense of, well, if you do need this email, like it's retained here, you'll have to reach out to us to get access to it. But we have better protections over it than it's just sitting in your mailbox or a file sitting in your OneDrive for 10 years, as an example. So usually a little bit more unique consideration on a client-by-client basis. But highly important, especially for regulatory customers that have a lot of PII.
Right. So we also have talked about data flow diagrams a lot on the CyberCall. And we know that we've been talking about how data inventory is a challenge for everybody, regardless of what size your organization is. And you just discussed, because data is everywhere, right? It's in the cloud, it's in, SaaS products, all these things. So how do you approach, and on-prem, how do you approach your clients when it comes to these two critical areas?
Yeah, so we generally come in and I follow the CIS Control 3 and subsequent safeguards as kind of that checklist, to really start working through, we got this data governance policy. Would this apply to you? Let's tweak that a little bit. But then 3.2 is really related to, where does the sensitive data exist? Like, where's your data inventory? And that's where we're really going in and defining the approved data repositories. Do you approve Dropbox? Right? And it's not the checklist that's that granular, but we're basically just whitelisting the approved data repositories within the organization to understand what shouldn't be approved. And then we can begin to put in some blanket level controls to begin to prevent access from those untrusted or unapproved locations, like somebody's personal Dropbox as a third-party cloud storage that they may be storing documents on, or downloading and saving documents locally to their BYOD personal laptop. Is another common data exfiltration that they're not maybe maliciously doing that, but it's happening. Another common area for that piece of it. From there, we're really taking a look at how can we begin to start to diagram out the most sensitive information. And usually when I come at this, back to Andrew's point about being a business advisor, a business consultant, this is where we're kind of evolving as MSPs. And we take a look at that and we come in and we say, what's the user journey? When we absorb this data from our customer, how does that get ingested? What is the genesis of that all the way through till we should be deleting it? And how does that transfer between parties? How does it get processed? What repositories are we storing it in? Is it going into email? Is it going into Teams? What does that look like? And if we have that in mind, we can have, in most cases, what I found is if you click and double click into that and you zoom in on the micro example, because the macro of thinking about how do we put in controls to fix everything is really just too much to consume. But if we double click and think on the macro and we say, okay, let's think about this workflow. Let's apply what we think would work here, and then zoom back out and see how much this would fix everything else at the macro level. In most cases, we can find 80 to 90% of the time that will flow through the rest of the business processes or business workflows of the organization. So there's a lot of commonalities there, at least that I've found, in doing this hands-on approach with clients.
Nick, quick question, if I may. Two questions come to mind. One, let's go to, you're down the line with a prospect, and hopefully we're uncovering what you just say we did a good job, and we're uncovering how this potential new customer does handle data, whether they're, handling it in a manner that they've thought about, or it's, ready, aim, ready, fire, aim type mentality. Does that, inform you a little bit? And Bob, maybe you too, as a somebody in the space of, hey, this is the kind of client we might be taking on here. Like, in other words, what kind of relationship we're going to have based on what we're hearing and how they do things. Does that kind of tip you off in that area?
Yeah, I'd love to hear you too on this, Bob, but I think so for sure. I mean, this is usually, if this is really messy, everything's really messy, right?
Right. That's where I'm getting. That's where I was getting like that. And what kind of, when we try to advise them, how well that's going to go.
Yeah, and that's the hardest conversation, because if they're the person that says we need to retain data forever, they still have an on-prem file share. They typically in that case have on-prem Exchange too, right? It's like one of those things where your propensity for having this legacy architecture just keeps branching out, and it's a lot harder conversation. So you do have some hard decisions to make in the sense of, is this a client that I really want to take on, given that this is going to ripple in this educational gap that they have today, of not wanting to move forward. Maybe they need that. The biggest bifurcation in my mind is if they're willing to invest and have the mentality that, yes, we recognize that there's a lot of risk here, but we are investing for the future, and they're creating a bridge to do that. Working with a client right now that has SharePoint Online, or SharePoint on-prem, Exchange on-prem, has a lot of their workstations still tied to local AD. It's just your typical, like, they haven't evolved much, and they're running, some legacy systems that are out of support even, but they want to invest, and they're moving forward on that, and they just need help on that progression path. So it's a good client to take on because they have that mindset. But is
hopefully we'll get Nick back in a second.
Yeah.
No, there you are, Nick. Nick, I was just going to ask, before we ask Bob, we lost a little bit at there, is how is the windmill doing, keeping their, AC running in this company?
yeah. It's it does feel like that. You're moving from a different era, right? A whole different mindset to wrap your head around, for sure.
Yeah, but I mean, well, look, we're our demographic are the, our targeted customer profile are enterprise customers, right? So these hybrid environments are the norm. And I never call it, what I always, there's two things. One is, for some people, if you start talking to them and they are doing it by looking at the math, like saying, well, 1 + 1 is too damn much, I don't want to expend, right? If that's the conversation, then that's going to limit how far you can go with them, right? If they're already in that philosophical hole, then it's very difficult to move them from that, right? You have to really use different techniques to do. Now, when you work with somebody who's willing, like Nick says, but just don't know how, that's not a problem. People like that are pretty easy to work with, and you can help work them out of the hole over time. But typically, it's not 50 shades of gray; it's 50 shades of fire, right? How hot is the fire in most of these places when you go into them? Because I've rarely met one that all the wheels were on, it was working like it was supposed to. Well, let me just be clear. I've never met one where all the wheels were where they were supposed to and planned out. So that means it's what degree of fire are we dealing with in a lot of cases, right? And I go back to those basic, and I tell everybody this: I can size a customer up in 60 seconds. Do you have a device inventory? Do you have a network map, including routing? And do you have a change management process? And if a no to any one of those occurs, it's in the 50 degrees of flame that we're going to be trying to figure out where they are in the spectrum, right? Because they're definitely in a spectrum at that point. If you get people who are willing to listen to the damn logic you're involved in because they know that they have risk, it's those are people that are not hard to work with. We tend to have to work with people who are I call them the sinners. You can't save those sinners unless you go where they sin, right? So we've developed some tactics to be able to work with people who are in those hybrid environments that have a lot of risk that has been organically grown over time, right? So, that free document I did about a cyber constitution, I work with Eric Tields on, right? So we use that to kind of rope in and fence off what our roles and responsibilities are. It at least gets you going, right? So you can start down the process of getting them where they need to be. But yeah, I'm 100% with Nick. It's always, I've never run into anybody that had it really all wired together. And I'm saying even with CISOs and things, they know theoretically in a lot of cases what need to happen from a practical operational standpoint. That's a lot more difficult than you might think, especially these organizations with these legacy networks, because you're talking about having to do a forklift upgrade on something that's just not that easy to do. So that's really where we're at.
Phyllis, quick over to you. I know you have less than 5 minutes you got to run, but I'm curious. Like I was reading about the city of Columbia in Kansas, so let's just turn, your data set of the MSI SAC. We have a huge data set here. We have MSPs. We know a lot of them work with, SLTTs, but is anything changing in mindset? Because it seems that on the margin, SLTTs have just been getting pretty hammered in 2024. Or, A, what's the mindset? B, are they more open to, collaborating with MSPs better? And, love your thoughts here.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's really, when you look at that, you definitely see the angst of mission versus security, right? So SLTTs feel a very high obligation to make sure services are available. And that is the number one focus, right? And so if they feel like anything is going to impact that main mission, providing that service, whatever it may be, power, water, school, whatever, that's their number one thing that they're looking for. And then of course there's the budget, right? Like all MSPs know, no one wants to pay for cyber, and SLTTs, their money is colored. And it's like, this goes to this service, this goes to that service. And, there's that, $1 billion money that came down for cyber. And that's something that the SLTTs can actually use for cybersecurity. So it is something that we need to encourage them to work with local MSPs, which we try to in the MSI SAC, to say, what is it that we can do? We often refer people, go to an MSP because you don't know anything about cyber. You really need to leverage your MSP to manage all those services for you. But I agree. I mean, it's difficult. People find religion after the fact. And it's often that is just way too late, right?
It just seems like this year has been worse than ever for education and county government. They just seem to be getting hammered. But anyway, let me let you ask a question or two before you run.
Yeah. So Nick, let's move on to data encryption and data masking, which are important. Encryption at rest and in transit. What challenges do you see that MSPs may have with this, and how do you approach it?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge today is more related to the hybrid in remote workforce concept. So people wanting to work anywhere on any device, and really that opening up a lot of security holes for us, especially on the encryption front. The data masking front is even further away from being able to be achieved, given there's a lot more controls that you would need to put into place to achieve that, but also some advancements to be able to scale out and do that across customers and repositories and things of that nature. So we're coming at it today just to give kind of our exposure. There's certainly many ways you could try to go tackle this. I think many of us, try to have all of our devices managed and have drive encryption. It's probably the most proliferation we see as far as like actually have encryption. Data is encrypted and rest in transit in Microsoft. So we have, some components there. And then we're doing, third-party backups that are encrypted as well too, for that data or those files within our ecosystem. It's kind of some standards we generally push out. But, the other concepts that we get into there is really, ideally you're trying to lock down access into just managed devices and restrict BYOD use. And it's hard to get to because people will start shouting, as soon as you start plugging those holes. And particularly, it's usually the C staff members at these customer sites that just start squawking like crazy. And they're the ones with the buying decision power, and they influence you more than anybody as well. So you run up against a hard conversation, which is why it's very important to get ahead of and give expectation settings, obviously, before turning those things on. But we do a mix of, easing them into it with some BYOD restrictions where people can't download files locally. They have to have a limited session time in the web browser if they're doing that. So just kind of chips away at that being a good experience for them where they want to use a managed device, but it's not restricting them from getting access to it altogether. The same token, we're using MAM policies with Intune to apply application level encryption on BYOD personal cell phones. And that's another good baseline that only causes some significant disruption if people really like to, use the native calendar application on the iPhone and the native mail app, because we can force people into quote unquote client approved apps that we manage, and we can encrypt the data. We can prevent jailbroken device access, some of the basic protections that really get into it. But I think, holistically, there has to be a push for driving a little bit more draconian policies around this, just because, that's our biggest threat, is an unmanaged device and really somebody getting hosed on that device where we don't have any protection. So it should be just part of the standards that we talk about with customers.
Cool. Bob, you want to wrap up with one more with that we have there? And
yeah, sure. We could do that because and actually I really wanted to circle back with it. I was waiting for Phyllis to do it, but now I'm glad I get to do it. But let's go back and talk about the data disposal part of that, because I think that's actually, an aspect of that's really important, right? We had to go through, I'll go ahead and dump mine on the table. We have data retention policies that are, that limit us on what we can keep, even email retention. We only keep what's absolutely necessary to do the job, or we are required to do by some sort of legal or regulatory action, right? So we have those policies in place and our systems enforce them. But from your perspective, Nick, I mean, what should those data disposal, what's the right kinds of technologies to look at for doing that? Or how do you, is there an automation process you can use? You've named some of the old 365 ones. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, generally for data disposal, primarily you're looking at the retention policy configurations within Microsoft. There's some native ones that go on, but then you can further granularly apply them to different sites or to email, to different data repositories. And they even have, for hybrid considerations, some extensibility down into on-prem file servers, or, they can scan documents in those use cases. So we typically try to use and leverage some of that to define or help define data retention. And then you get into, sensitivity labels in Microsoft as well, which do come part of, SMB subscriptions like Business Premium that not many people adopt. But if we can apply a basic data taxonomy for, highly confidential all the way down to public, then we can also apply granular retention policies to those documents as well that are part of the policy labels, or the label policies, I should say. So those are the two biggest ones we use. I don't like to list off, a ton. There's certainly third parties out there. A lot of them are cost inhibitive to SMB, like a Varonis as an example. I don't need to name drop a vendor, but just one that's super expensive that does a really good job. But it's not, not in the ballpark for SMB to be able to purchase, or us as MSPs to be able to resell it. So a lot of constraints there, but I think just the basics, of just applying a retention policy that's a blanket one is a good place to start and move backwards, over time as part of a QBR process, continuous planning, and all of that.
Yeah. Well, I'll give a quick plug, Nick. I don't know if you guys have heard Nick, Netrix finally got their multi-tenant cloud-based solution out. And so I'm excited to see how that, penetrates throughout the MSP market. So, yeah. I know we're at the top of the hour. Nick, that was awesome. I really appreciate you coming on, and really wishing you the best of success in your upcoming ventures. Really excited for you. Anytime, one, you give back to the community. Again, if you could just share, I put it up earlier, but what is the URL for your all your content that you share readily every week for free? We're always huge advocates of that. Feel free to share that out with everybody in chat. Oh, I'll share it if you want, because you either have to be on you have to be on YouTube to do that.
Oh, no worries.
What is it again, Nick? Real quick, the T-minus?
T-365.com. Yep.
Yeah, T-minus 365 on YouTube. So thanks, Pat. Good seeing you. Good seeing everybody. Bob, thanks so much for sitting in for Gary. You filled his shoes very well. Happy fourth quarter, everybody. Here we come.